Today I'm gonna talk about the irrationalist's view on the relation between philosophy and science. In particular, I want to talk about two philosophers, Kierkegaard and Jaspers. Since Jaspers was heavily influenced by Kierkegaard, I will briefly talk about Kierkegaard's views, then I will move on to Jaspers. During the first half of my talk, I will address Kierkegaard's attack on science in favor of non-systematic philosophy. And during the second half, I will explain why, according to Jaspers, philosophy is at odds with science. The main reason why science and philosophy come into conflict is because science fails to take human existence into account. Neither Jaspers nor Kierkegaard was anti-scientific. This should be emphasized. They were not against science. In fact, they both praised science. However, they each wanted to show that the objective approach is not enough. In a note from 1846, Kierkegaard makes a very radical claim. He says, ultimately all corruption will come from the natural sciences. What you need to know is that in an early letter, Kierkegaard praised science and he said how he appreciated science and how he wanted to devote his life to science. In that same letter, he does mention that ultimately he decided to do philosophy instead, but what's clear from that letter is that for some time Kierkegaard seriously considered studying science. This is obviously in sharp contrast to this claim that I just read moments ago. The main reason that Kierkegaard gives for his idea that the natural sciences would one day ruin humanity is this. A scientist would, in the best conceivable case, be able to explain nature as a whole, but that scientist would at the same time fail to reach an understanding of himself as a human being. As we will later see in Jaspers, we need philosophy to live as human beings. Kierkegaard's worry was that if philosophy became too contaminated with science, existence would be reduced to something meaningless. Incidentally, that was Nietzsche's worry as well. How could Kierkegaard come to such a negative assessment of the science's contribution to the history of thought? On the one hand, it is well known that between 1835 and 1846, Kierkegaard developed a criticism of objective and systematic thought, of which Hegel's philosophy seemed to provide the classic example. If a system of philosophy such as Hegel's Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences had to be rejected due to its failure to emphasize the perspective of the existing individual, then for the very same reason a system of knowledge based merely on the natural sciences had to be rejected. There are two problems here. Firstly, there is the problem of systematization, which we will talk about later. Secondly, if we reduced philosophy to science, as does Alex Rosenberg, we would give up on important questions that make life worth living. To paraphrase Kierkegaard, suppose a scientist uses a microscope in order to study the emergence of consciousness in our brain. If he then looks and looks and looks and finally comes to the conclusion that he cannot find consciousness there, then this cannot be considered as serious, but only as something droll. Now, to give my talk a structure, I will talk about the threefold concept of speculation, science, and scholarship in Kierkegaard's philosophy. This threefold concept occupied a key place among the intellectual furniture of Kierkegaard's everyday world. Let's start with a speculation. Speculation is to be found in both the ancient and the modern world. Kierkegaard's focus is on the modern thinkers whose theocentric speculation has not managed to limit itself to being theocentric behind the lectern 3 times a week from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m., as he puts it. A major theme in Kierkegaard's thinking and writing is speculation's failure to give appropriate consideration to the human being's individual existence. He does not take a stand against speculation itself, but he does feel compelled to criticize thinking that does not recognize its limits. In the concluding unscientific postscript, Kierkegaard talks about the objective issue of the truth of Christianity. He thinks the objective treatment of Christianity strives to arrive at truth by means of permeating Christianity with thought. However, the person of Christian faith, passionately concerned about gaining an eternal happiness, is intensely engaged in the inwardness of his or her subjective existence. He points out that, in attempting to be objective, the speculative thinker ends up moving away from the subjective inwardness. Now let's move on to the next concept, science. Kierkegaard plays with the words lidenskap and videnskap. The first word means passion and the second word means science in Danish. But it's not just the similarity of the words that make them connected for Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard believed that he lived in an age that had crossed out passion in order to serve science. Kierkegaard was a careful thinker who knew the danger of blurring important distinctions. Science is established on the premise of making distinctions, so Kierkegaard clearly appreciated the world of science. One of his pseudonyms states how every scientific issue within the larger compass of science has its definite place, but when the deliberation forgets where it properly belongs, it forgets itself and becomes something else. In works such as The Concept of Anxiety and The Sickness unto Death, Kierkegaard was careful to delineate the particular train of psychology, dogmatics, and ethics. He believed that each concept must be dealt with by the science to which it belongs. Above all, every science must vigorously lay hold of its own beginning and not live in complicated relations with other sciences. For Kierkegaard, not all the sciences operate at the same level. Every science lies either in a logical immanence or in an immanence within a transcendence that it is unable to explain. A science that operates in a logical immanence is like physics. The point he's trying to make is that physics, philosophy, theology, these are separate realms. We should not consider all of them on the same level. But perhaps even most importantly, even the deliverances of science should be grasped at the personal level. Meaning, even if we study science, we should keep in mind that what we read should give us some personal message. Besides pointing out the need for each science to respect its parameters and subject matter, it also needs to recognize that it cannot accomplish everything. For instance, the self cannot be grasped by science, at least according to Kierkegaard. Furthermore, the scientific is impersonal, while existence is personal. It is the job of philosophy to deal with the personal sphere. This is why Kierkegaard identifies doubt as being important to science. So while irony is important for human life, doubt is important for science. People mistakenly think that the scientific way of thinking can be transferred into personal life. But for philosophers such as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, that possibly cannot be the case. The reason is that existing is an art, not a science. The subjective thinker is not a scientist scholar, but an artist. The subject must think as an existing person. Finally, let's talk about scholarship. In his dissertation, The Concept of Irony, Kierkegaard had stated that if our generation has any task at all, it must be to translate the achievement of scientific scholarship into personal life. That is why for Kierkegaard, philosophy cannot be equated with scholarship. As mentioned before, it is not enough to think abstractly. It is not enough to think scientifically. At the heart of Kierkegaard's philosophy is ethics, and for him, ethics means acting. A philosophy that does not prompt us to act is not worth anything. Philosophy means being engaged and taking action. Kierkegaard talks about the danger of intoxication. The danger lies in mistakenly identifying knowing with doing. The problem as he sees it is that the age's priests of philosophy demand that theology, as well as all other disciplines, must become scholarly and scientific and state their claims from an objective distance. Scholarship distances itself from life and, in that sense, is not upbuilding. Compare this with the Christian attitude that Kierkegaard praises. The Christian, at least the type of Christian that Kierkegaard has in mind, does everything he can to relate himself to life. He does not distance himself from life. In the old days, all stood in relation to the monastery. Now all stand in relation to the professor. In both cases, the individual has no room for understanding himself. Although Kierkegaard's criticism is mainly concerned with theology, it also applies to philosophy. Kierkegaard clarifies that scholarly interpreting of the Bible can interfere with reading God's Word. To read the Bible with a dictionary is not to be reading the Bible. This is the deception that scholarship can bring. The same goes for any philosophical text. That's why Kierkegaard wanted to distance his own philosophy from systematic philosophers. The task of philosophy is to remind us that what we read concerns us individually.